Well, welcome to the David Donnan podcast. We have a very special episode because for only the second time in the podcast history, we're having a guest back on. Just a second, we're going to say hello to Ted Goshorn. But before we get to him, if you are looking for a church in the Glenville, Georgia area outside of Savannah, if you want a Bible believing evangelical Wesleyan church, we would love to have you worship with us at the Glenville Methodist Church Sundays 9 and 11. Friends, it is a joy to have a longtime friend on the podcast, Ted Goshorn. Ted is an ordained Methodist pastor. He holds a degree, a doctor of ministry from the Candler School of Theology at Emory University, along with various degrees from Emory, James Madison University, and Berry College. He recently started a new career in wealth management, and he is married to his wife, Dana, and they have two wonderful children. Ted, thank you so much for taking time to hang out with us. How are you doing, buddy?
I'm doing well. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for this opportunity.
All right, you are back on the podcast. You came on for season two. You were one of two episodes in season two that were focused on prayer. It was you and Howard Snyder. So, on his
Wow.
prayer book, yeah. You are back on because you've written a wonderful book that I've been privileged to have read. It's called Raise Your Ebenezer. It's a really cool book. I like the trail themes. It's got like a stamp on the front of it. It's got a little trail guide type thing for you to write notes in it. But let's get to the reason why you wanted to write this book.
Well, it came as a suggestion from a good dear friend of mine when I was serving at Eastman First Methodist. Um, we made really good friends with the Snyders and not related to Howard. And Graham, I was on the phone with Graham back in March of last year, just talking about, what I and my family were experiencing. And Graham suggested I write my way through it. We were going through a really hard season as a family. I, talk about that in the book. I'm happy to get in more into that with you for the podcast. But Graham just gave me this great suggestion to write my way through it. I think by writing, I've kept a journal for 20 years, um, and it helped. And as I was writing, it turned into this book. Some of them are sermons that I've preached in the past that I adjusted to become chapters. I've always been a manuscript preacher, and then others, I wrote as I was going through stuff, and so that became the manuscript, and I sent it off in July to my great publishers, Advocate Press in South Carolina, and they agreed to publish it, and here we are.
So you go into this in the book, you talk about this season of suffering that you went through. Why don't you tell us about what that was and how it affected you and your family?
Yeah, so and that's going to take a minute if that's all right.
Yeah, go
I
for
don't
it.
know. I don't know that I've got the short version down yet. And I would say we're still emerging from it. Like I think we're at the tail end of it, but we're not quite done with our season, our journey, as I talk about it in the book. So I've always been sicker than the average person, and knew that. And doctors had always just said basically I was just unlucky. So fall of 2023, I got really sick. And it was a combination of really respiratory illnesses, and I've got asthma, and so it just seemed like it was just really, really bad luck. But over-the-counter prescriptions, antibiotics were not helping me, and I was getting worse, in fact. And so I ended up in the hospital in December of 2023, and started a long road to recovery. That led me to really push on my doctors to say, I think something is wrong. I don't think this is just bad luck. I am otherwise healthy. I, eat reasonably. I exercise regularly. I don't have, besides the asthma, I don't have any other kind of underlying condition. This does not make sense. So, and I had taken leave from the church I was serving because I was just too weak and too sick. Even after I got out of the hospital and started to recover, I was just still very weak. So eventually landed with an immunologist who was able to diagnose me. I have, this is a misnomer. It's called common variable immunodeficiency, and it's only common because it's the most common version of immunodeficiency, which means about 250,000 people across the country have it. So that diagnosis led to a treatment, and the treatment is very treatable. I'm on the treatment now. It has made a world of difference. I'm the healthiest I've ever been in my adult life. But the insurance it took 2 months to get a diagnosis from getting out of the hospital. So that's February of 2024. And then it took 2.5 months for insurance to approve the medication. I had to go through a process for them. It's very expensive. And so, they took a minute. My doctor had told me that I was required to work from home, avoid the public, act like it was the pandemic again, because my immune system was so weak. She said, the common cold could put you back in the hospital. So that meant no preaching, no leading meetings at church. I was delegating those things and just keeping it, there's a lot you can do from home in terms of managing a large operation, which was the church I was serving was a very large operation. But the church, the committee, that oversees us Methodist pastors, got impatient with my recovery. And, despite what I was telling them, grew very concerned that I wouldn't be able to return. And so in April asked for a new senior pastor rather than the meeting was supposed to just be to ask for an interim to come in. And, that was just absolutely awful for me and my family. It rocked our stability. It's, there, because of the split, in the denomination, there was no opportunity for me because I'm committed to remaining in the UMC. And, I recognized that very quickly that the annual conference was not going to support me the way that it had promised. And so it did not, I just had no confidence that, there really was going to be some sort of church offering for me at some point. And, seeing how the systems that were supposed to protect me had failed me and seeing how the annual conference, it was not living up to its end of its promises. It really started me on a process of prayerfully considering what's the right next step for me in terms of a career. So Dana and I said, my wife, we're going to just go real broad with this. I'm going to apply for jobs, contact bishops, keep options open, and see what God does through that. And the end result of that was choosing one of the right next steps for us was choosing to relocate to North Carolina. You see the snow out the window, we're buried in the mountains. And we did that in July, made that decision in July. And sold our house in Macon, just recognizing there was an opportunity for us there. And it was very expensive to remain there compared to living here. And then, the right opportunity came along I got to be careful with what exactly I say here, but I'll say Edward Jones hired me. And very soon I'll be able to function as a financial advisor. And I can look back now, and I talk about this in the book, and I can see how in January of 2024, I felt God, what I now understand was a renewal of my calling, say that, beyond establishing a better life for my children and my family, which is, I've got, some things there that are really meaningful to me about, the life that I want to leave for them. I felt called to help people establish a firm financial foundation. We experienced a lot of challenges over the last year. Finances was not one of them because we had really good, solid wisdom from our financial advisor. And so, and had followed that advice for several years. So I thought at the time that was just about repairing the very broken finances of the church I was serving and really focusing my efforts there. But now I can see that it's about doing what I'm about to do. And my heart and passion are to work with folks who are struggling with their finances and help them, turn over a new financial leaf and build a firm foundation. So I feel like I can see now, faith is believing in advance will only make sense in reverse, right? As Philip Yancey says. And I can see now looking backwards how God was preparing me to move into this role. But it's been a real challenge starting over. I had very little background in the financial services industry. I've drunk from a fire hose since October when I started. But it's been really good. And I am excited to see what God does through this moving forward.
You did a little bit of explaining the emotions you went through when your church asked for another pastor. What about as you were getting sick, as you're going to the hospital? I think that's something people are really going to relate to because
Hmm.
everybody has that happen to them or has somebody close that happened to them. What was your emotions like? What was your family's emotion like as it was this, long diagnosis that was several trips to the hospital without clear answers? What were you going through and how did that affect your relationship with God?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I drew. First thing that comes to mind is I remember getting a text from the hospitalist, um, who, a friend of ours, was reviewing my charts and texted and, said that I had mild heart failure, which apparently can happen with pneumonia. And one of the things I was dealing with at that point was pneumonia. But the thought that I was 40 years old and had mild heart failure was really hard. So there were a few moments, and that was the worst of them, where I really wrestled with my mortality and the frailty of human life. Um, Another one of those moments was learning that the medicine that I'm on for my condition is relatively new. And before, if I had been diagnosed, my options would have been to either live like a hermit, avoid the public, find a job I could do from home, just deal with the chronic fatigue, and or live life normally, but accept that I would die at a young age because eventually I'd pick up, a cold, the flu, COVID, something, and my body wouldn't be able to fight it off, and it would take my life. Um, so wrestling with my mortality, it brings things into focus in a hurry, of what really matters. The weight, and I guess this was a good thing in the end. I didn't know I was going to have to change careers and lose my old career at the time, but like all of a sudden, the things that I thought were so important about the way I was trying to build a career through ministry didn't matter anymore. Um, and that was a conversation that God and I had, and I got real about that with God. Um, and that's been really healthy going into a new career. I'm going into it, I think, with a much healthier um, basis. Um, I felt scared at times. Um, Other times it was like my defense mechanism was to be like, okay, I got enough life insurance, and imagined, how much money would be left over after paying off debts, and how my wife and children would use that money. And I think that's just where my brain went to try to um, deal with what I was feeling. Um, the frustration. I have a lot I could say that would be for a different podcast episode about the state of our healthcare system, um, because of the difficulty of getting doctors to talk to each other and feeling like I was the only conduit through which information flowed. And I don't have a background in medicine. Um, and so, I didn't feel like I was the right person to be explaining to my cardiologist, to my pulmonologist, to my primary care doctor, to my immunologist, all the things that I thought they should be sharing with each other. Um, so a lot of frustration. But I also like coming out of it, it was like, it was like the things that I couldn't control were so big and so many and so scary. I learned how to say, what can I control? Do that, which was not very much, and leave the rest to God.
Hmm.
And I really was able, I really found like a way to do that. And that's a good thing I hadn't thought a lot about until right now. So I don't know that I've got a great way to explain it, but it was like I just found this peace in being able to say, these things I can't control.
Hmm.
And so, there are a lot of those things. And so to say prayerfully to God, you're going to have to deal with it. Um, and just grant me the wisdom to recognize what I need to know so that I can be an advocate for myself and my family, for my health. Just help me, grant me that wisdom and knowledge,
Hmm.
but then help me know when to let go.
Yeah.
Um, so I, I came out, and I think all four of us came out of this in a stronger place in our faith. But that's because we went through periods of wrestling and struggle.
So you have gone through this, you've written this book to process it, and you kind of settled on this field guide or this field manual concept. What drew you to that idea? Was your editor like, hey, this is the way we could package it, or did you feel draw to that?
I don't know where exactly that came from. Um, I I think it just kind of came to me as I was writing and putting the book together. Well, I knew that I wanted a journey motif as I was going through it because what I wanted to do was provide people with a guide, and field guide eventually, I guess, came out of that, but almost like a manual for finding your way through the wilderness. And yeah, as much as you can provide one of those, everybody has their own journey they have to go through. But I wanted it to be not just a what is suffering or some academic discourse on the nature of suffering, but a real practical guide to say, how do we find our way through these these times of real hardship and strife? Um, and so I think just as I was writing, it kind of came out that way. It may have been something that Dana or one of my children suggested to me. I can't remember exactly, but so my hope is that in providing that motif and then in providing space to journal, a lot of chapters end with a question, and I'm hoping that that becomes a prompt to then be able to respond in those blank spaces. I had my editor leave a full page at the end
Yeah.
of every chapter for that reason, wanting people to really interact and apply their own journey in the hopes that what I wrote and the experience that I shared will help them find their way through their own time of suffering.
Yeah. I really enjoyed that. I felt like for some of the chapters, because I'm not in like a season of suffering, there's maybe like a third of them. I was like, I don't know really what to write. But for the ones I did, I found extremely helpful in the space. Not just like a fluff pad in your page count, but actually very helpful space to process. Um,
No, I'm glad to hear that.
what do you think the benefit is if people take time not just to just blow through a book, but make notes in the margin and then fill out your questions at the end?
I mean, I think it's the gift of processing and allowing the Holy Spirit to speak through that processing, through that process. We with yeah, it's a tired motif in our society, but the idea that we just consume information all the time, and so to blow through a book, you and I both did that in seminary, right? Like, just I just need to know what the main points are here, so I can write the report or take the test or whatever it is. We're just consuming that information to write in the margins, to respond to the questions, to use that space for journaling is to really process it and take it in and apply it and be changed by it. And I think the Holy Spirit really guides that process. And so I think the benefit is just a really deep learning and an invitation for this book to be part of your own journey.
You talk in chapter 5 about how we need to expect to lose security. And I think about
Hmm.
the way my life is and the way I try to lead my family and lead my church to keep them in a secure place or encourage them how to get on a secure path. But really, it left me with this question: is security just an illusion?
Hmm. It's a great question. And I'll tell you, like, and it's funny. I mean, I'm now in the business of wanting people to create financial security, right? Which life can you can be have all sorts of money saved away for retirement and emergency fund, et cetera, and life can take that away very quickly.
Mhm.
So I don't. I'll tell you how I would have answered that question a year ago, and then I'll tell you where my wrestling is because I don't have a great answer at the moment. A year ago, what I would have said is God doesn't cause suffering. Suffering purely comes from the fact that evil exists in the world and it occasionally impacts us. And, if we will draw close to God and basically double down on our faith, God will redeem that suffering, not because we've doubled down, but because we've drawn close. We'll experience God's redemption of that suffering and we'll come out the other side stronger, better, and better able to serve the kingdom. I don't know that there's really anything wrong with what I just said, but the wrestling I have now is I can't 100% say on this other, now that I'm emerging into the other side, that it was just redemption that I'm experiencing.
Mhm.
And that's in part because, I'm a member of an associate at Greenbow, the prayer retreat center, up the road from you. And right after the church I was serving kicked me to the curb, I went down there. They made space for me, and I sat with one of the spiritual directors and, shared my story. And she knew about it already some, but she looked at me and she said, I think God has delivered you. It just looks a little funny. And I look back now, my plan before I got sick was I was going to serve that church 10 to 15 years. I was going to put it on right footing and I was going to retire early. I was miserable as a pastor. I didn't realize just how miserable I was. Um, and I was saving money as much as I could in a fund so that I could retire when my wife could retire from teaching in her early 50s. So my misery, I think, would have driven me out sooner, a lot sooner than 10 to 15 years. But also seeing that I was in a very toxic situation and didn't really realize it until I was out of it. That toxicity either would have consumed me and I would have had to have left, or the church would have kicked me out within, I think, a year or two had I not gotten sick.
Mm.
Um, it was a very bad situation. And I I have a lot I could say about why I think that I needed to be out of pastoral ministry. And that may be for another podcast episode, but um,
Well,
I
let
do
me
think that God,
let me ask you this because
okay.
I've wondered this. Like, I know, like, we have a theology that you're called, you're ordained to like a career in the life of ministry, but I got a list of maybe half the colleagues I've had who have left ministry or left one denomination. It- should we celebrate like the faithfulness of, hey, God called you for a season and that may be it, and He may call you back for another season, but maybe we should widen our view of calling not as a career,
Well,
but as a lifestyle that sometimes equals a career or a season in a career.
yeah. Well, that's a great question. So, I think the reason I can't fully say whether or not security is an illusion is that I feel like God did deliver me,
Hmm.
and that is a tough thing to wrestle with when you say God called you and God like and the process you and I both went through is God called you for life.
Hmm.
And when I submitted my application to my new bishop asking for appointment to extension ministry in my current job, it got rejected because it wasn't ministry,
Hmm.
which I very much think that it is. And so I'm on personal leave as my appointment, um, and which is fine. I can't really gripe about that, but I can gripe that I think our definition of ministry is far too narrow.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that God has adjusted my calling. Um, and one of the things that I feel called to do is to walk alongside churches financially.
Hmm.
And what even if they never invest money with me, to sit in the room and be able to say things that maybe the pastor has said or wants to say, but feels like he or she can't. Be able, for example, churches that I served, I struggled to get them out of the mindset that the way to raise funds and get back to a financially healthy place is purely through the offering plate. I don't think that is the way forward for churches anymore. Differentiating income streams, I think, is the way forward, and seeing how a broader definition of what church ministry looks like in the community can raise funds through, say, rental income or partnering with a nonprofit or outsourcing some aspects of the church. So, if I can sit in a room and aid a pastor and aid a church by providing that kind of wise counsel, then, that's ministry. And I
Hmm.
want to do that.
Hmm.
I'm also, I've got some um, opportunities that I probably can't say much about at this point up here, where it might be that I'm attached to a church in an employment kind of relationship on a very, very part-time basis, where I'm still serving the local church. Um, but my I do think that we need a broader definition. Um, I think we need a to celebrate when it's a season. Because for some people it is. I'm not sure that that's what it is for me, but that's an emerging um, understanding. Broaden our imaginations about what God is doing through ordained people.
Hmm.
And I also think that we need to take a really hard look at the interplay and the support that we provide, the interplay between churches and clergy and the support that is provided to that clergy in the midst of their appointment.
Hmm.
Um, and before I run off on a different tangent that's outside the scope of the book, um, I think your question is really good, and those are my thoughts.
Um, you talk in chapter 8, which was my favorite chapter, about going into the valley and how to get out.
Hmm.
You just want to share with the audience. I mean, I think if you're going to buy the book, like that alone is worth it, that chapter. Do you want to share a little bit about that chapter and how you do get out of the valley?
Yeah, um, I appreciate that. And I'm actually, I have my copy. Let me pull open chapter 8 for myself. I looked over it the other day, just to remind myself. I think for me, I talked to somebody else recently who had, is recently coming out of her own journey of suffering. And she said, and this was kind of my mantra too, it was like, I don't want to end up bitter. I
Hmm.
don't want to end up jaded and living life from that place. And I knew that early on. And so I think that happens when we give up. That's how we get stuck in the valley. We just throw our hands up in the air and we're just like, whatever. This is just life now. And that's a loss of hope. And when I talk in the afterword about finding hope, the line from Matthew's version of the parable of the lost sheep that let me turn over here, I'll quote it to you, that stands out to me, that really spoke to me as I was going through this is it's Matthew 18:14. It is not the will of our Father in heaven that one of these little ones should be lost. So we might feel lost in the valley for a time, and that's will happen, from time to time. But it's not God's will that we stay lost. Like God is going to find us. We might be that lost sheep, but God is going to find us, and it's our duty to draw close, um, continue to search and seek, have a wide open imagination about what God is doing. Um, I think the um, the C.S. Lewis quote that I have in here about from Narnia, about here on the mountain I've spoken to you clearly will not always be so down in Narnia. Is that call to pull from our faith
Hmm.
of those experiences we've had previously and say, God was there for me before. God's going to do it again.
Hmm.
God, I know God through these signs and these symbols, and it might be cloudy or there might be some doubt now about that, but it's still I can still pull from that and trust in that. Faith at times is an act of courage and it's an act of intention. It's not passive. And to take that courage, choose that intentionality in those valley experiences, I think is what C.S. Lewis, I'm on page 78, is talking about, in that chapter. Um, and just, this was an emerging thing for us, but just saying like what God might be doing through this is way beyond my imagination.
Hmm.
And all I can do is go one step at a time. So to borrow Lovett Weems from, church stuff, what's the next faithful step?
Hmm.
And just take that one step and trust that when the time is right, the next step will be evident. And
Hmm.
eventually that step after step will emerge from the valley.
Yeah. You did such a great job of like, this is a great resource to hand somebody who is going through these valleys themselves. One of the things that I found myself asking, or the person I was thinking about that might be even worthy of a whole second book, would be how do you walk alongside people who are suffering? Because
Hmm.
suffering, sometimes it's almost easier to be the person suffering than having to watch a loved one suffer. I mean, I think of like if a child is sick, the first thought the parents usually have is like, I wish it was me being sick and being able to fight this illness versus having to see my child suffer, or my spouse suffer, or my
Hmm.
mom or dad. So, do you have any advice for somebody who says, I'm not in this season of suffering, but I'm secondhand in the season of suffering because a loved one is suffering?
Yeah. Yeah, I do. the first thing I think of is to listen and not try to provide solutions.
Mhm.
And I hope it's evident from the book. Like I provide resources, guidance, ideas, but I'm not trying to provide a solution because there is no solution to suffering except God.
Mhm.
Um, and when we try to, provide solutions or say, do this, do this, do this, we shut people down. So to listen deeply with empathy, I think is first and foremost. Um, the thing I think about that got us through as a family, because we all four of us suffered in different ways. Um, and Carter, my youngest, he's 9, comes to mind the most for me because Carter was often the only child at that church and got loved on every Sunday morning, by the people, the volunteers we had ready to receive other children who usually weren't there.
Mhm.
And the betrayal that he feels, the loss of security. I mean, that is the first time he's ever felt those things in
Mhm.
his life. Um, so what became important for us were a couple of things. One was routine. To establish a really good routine of some sort of collective spiritual practice. And for us, that was, and I forget which chapter it's in, but I talk about the practice of examine out of the book Sleeping with Bread. I'll see if I can figure that out real quick. Um, but what their thing is sit around the dinner table and over the course of the conversation, um, ask each other, what are you most grateful for today? What are you least grateful for today? And that gives rise to really essential conversations.
Mhm.
And we would just listen,
Mhm.
not often point to solutions or not ever point to solutions, not often point to do anything, just empathize with each other and practice vulnerability. And
Mhm.
that became really essential. Then Carter actually started this himself. He wanted to pray for us silently when we would tuck him in. And he had this little prayer jar that the church that fired me, um, he had made as a craft in one of the Sunday school classes. And so he had this pile of change. And he wanted us, after he prayed for us, we would also pray for him silently, to move a coin from the pile into the jar. And I don't really know why. It was
So
just his thing.
it sounds like a money making scheme. Here, pray for me and put a coin in here for me.
Right. So he but so it just and we did that night after night. Um to the power of presence is huge, to just be present with someone who's suffering. Um there were a lot of times that Carter was just inconsolable. And what we did was he just snuggled in my bed with me and Dana if she was home. Um, and we watched a show that he really likes on Netflix, and just snuggled until he calmed down, because just the power of presence is is really important, and I think we undervalue it. Um, so, I think when we're walking alongside someone who's suffering, to be present, to listen well, and to establish good routines that allow for the practice of vulnerability is really key.
Awesome. You're a really good writer. Obviously
Thank
you
you.
were transitioning, so you had a little more free time, but you also had a lot of stuff that you were worried about and trying to do and sell a house
Hmm.
and change careers. What's your writing routine like?
So yeah, this routine was really like there wasn't much of a routine. It was more like when I needed to escape from whatever the latest stressor was, or we were trauma is what we have experienced, and trauma, that we're just we would think things would settle, and then there'd be something else that would pop up that would be threatening, and sometimes looking back, some of those things weren't threatening, but our trauma geared brain saw them as threats.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and so it became an escape. Um, Prior to that. So I don't know that I've got a good routine answer for how I put this book together. Um,
But it
but
does sound like you had like it was more of a way for you to pour yourself out, like when you had time and
mhm,
also when you felt like that urge, which I think, that is a legitimate style of writing, to let it fill up and then pour it out. And then you feel good, like you've, poured it out to get it out
mhm.
of you some.
Yeah. And absolutely, that was the case. And yeah, I think one of the things that's really critical for me, and maybe this is for others, is I did everything on this computer that I'm on. And we do so much on our computers, it's easy to sit down and say, I'm going to write, and then get distracted by other things.
I don't know what you're
So,
talking about. I can't relate to that at all.
so when I would sit down to write, I sat in the same place. I drank the same drink, which was tea. I know what you're probably thinking. It was not whiskey. That was later in the
I was like,
evening.
I'm not asking.
Yeah, that was later in the evening. Um, Now I make
What
hot
type of
tea,
tea? What type of hot tea?
usually mint, herbal.
Like a peppermint, just regular mint, like
Yeah, like just a regular mint.
okay.
Um, and there's something about like I think the smell of the mint. I'm studying for these crazy hard financial industry exams that I just did. I made tea, mint tea. It was like the smell of it, just brought me to that place where I
Hmm.
could really focus, and so having that kind of routine of when I sit down to write, there's this drink, there's this spot that I'm sitting in, there's whatever. I wrote on my deck out here because it was really mild. It was May, June, and up here in the mountains, it's beautiful that time of year. So, um, that I think really helped. I can tell you what my preaching routine used to be, but I'm not really utilizing that anymore right now.
What what advice would you have for somebody who wants to consider writing about something like that, a trauma or experience, and turning it into a book?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is I had to be careful not to overshare. So sometimes I wrote and I did overshare, and then I went back and I edited to be appropriate. Um, I wanted to make sure that I was not causing people to read my own therapy notes. Um, I think to be disciplined, and discipline can seem antithetical to creativity, but I think discipline creates the proper boundaries for um, so to be disciplined, to write as you feel exactly what needs to come out of your brain, and then go back and edit it and just be really faithful to the editing process. I think is really key. And I made this mistake with the afterword. I broke one of my own rules. One of my rules is never publish something the day I write it, because I always see it differently and I catch stuff the next day. And I wrote the afterword quickly. I sent it to my publisher, and she sent me back, the PDF of the book for my final approval. And I read the afterword again. I was like, oh, I'm going to make her mad because I'm going to send her this massively revised version, but I needed to. And she was cool with it, and she's great to work with. Um, but I broke that rule, and that rule I think has been really important because I really caught stuff that I needed to either better explain, stuff I needed to edit out, things that I needed to expand upon. Um, it's just that's been a big rule for me.
Nice. Um, Usually at the end of the podcast, we do our final five questions. You've already been on and answered the final five, so I'm trying to come up with, when somebody's a second time guest, some things to ask. So I want
Mm-hmm.
to ask you some alternate questions. How have you shown kindness to yourself lately?
All the time in starting a new career. I think the hardest thing has been feeling incompetent. I'm highly educated. I felt very confident in my old career, and being trained to take these exams and learn about things that I knew didn't even know existed. Um, I felt very incompetent. And so to be like, like God has me here. This is the path forward. It's going to get better. I've had to show myself a lot of grace or kindness in that.
And what do you do to do that?
Self-talk, pretty much, just recognizing and being like, okay, Ted, like it's going to be okay, and talking about it with Dana.
Um, I read a study somewhere. I can't quote it, but it said one of the key indicators, and I think it had to do with sports, was people would actually literally talk out loud positively to themselves. Um, so that's
I've
cool.
done that on some of my walks. Here in our neighborhood, walking has been really essential too, because that's a way of like if I've been sitting too long or I just have some tension that's built up, like releasing that. And there have been times on a walk that I've been like, okay, Ted, you got this. Like yeah.
Cool. Um, how has your spiritual rhythms changed or your rule of life? And by rule of life, I don't mean like rules to follow, but like that, that support for your life. How's it changed as somebody who was in full-time ministry and now switching gears into this different career?
It's actually one thing I don't know that really has changed. My personal devotional practices have remained pretty constant. And when I became an associate of Greenbow, I agreed to uphold their rule of life. And so part of my practice is I read a portion of that rule of life every day. And so that I'm, mindful of it and continuing to abide by it.
Very cool. Are there any things that stick out that you found particularly helpful in the season that you're in from your rule of life that you've really enjoyed leaning into or have been really helpful?
Absolutely. And it lives inside the front cover of my Bible. Um, I'll read to you from it briefly. At some point, this paper is going to fall apart and I'm going to be very sad. The first point of the rule of life through seven is the sacrament of the present moment. And when so much was in turmoil and so much was unknown, and I wanted a clear picture of the future, and I didn't have it, being the sacrament of the present moment was really essential. And so, in part, it says, in gratitude for the gift of life, we will seek to be aware of God present in every moment, trusting that as we respond in faith to the duties of each day, God is revealed. In these moments, we would see and hear and taste and touch the goodness of God, and we would ask the Holy Spirit to guide our thoughts and words and actions that we might glorify God in all. And that would bring me back to saying, that's what I read on Mondays, but sometimes I go back and read it again. That would bring me back to saying, just be present with this moment, with, what your children want to do, with, being attentive to myself, to experiencing the beauty of the mountains that you can't see that I can look at right over here. I tried to, but the lighting didn't work. Um, just taking in the glory of the creation around me. That was really essential.
That's beautiful. What is one area you would like to grow in your life? It could be something with your career. It could be something with you've downsized your house a little bit smaller there, but you got a really cool setup. It looks like there. Like, what's something you're like,
Way smaller.
I hope I grow in this area in the next 6 months, year, a couple years.
um, my first answer is I've done so much growing. I'm good for a break. And but that's never
But
the
that's
case
it.
in life.
No, but that's an answer though, growing your contentment of not feeling the pressure to grow. I mean, I think that's something,
Yeah.
especially with our Wesleyan theology of we're always supposed to be moving on to perfection. I mean, there's a dark side to that. That's like, well, I'm a piece of trash because I'm not growing, and so
Hmm.
there can be a bad side to it. So maybe
I
it's just
think so.
contentment.
Well, to your point, I think what's good there is that I am discovering ways that I have grown as I'm living out my life. I am way more patient. I am much kinder, um, but I'm also much more discerning. And I'm discovering those things, and then I'm journaling about them so that they take root. But those are consequences of what I've been through, and also I think being out of pastoral ministry. This job isn't nearly as stressful. And it's much easier for me to manage on an intrapersonal level. And so I'm finding those benefits and those things. And so I think the task is, as I recognize those things, going through my own process, like writing them down in my journal so they take root, but then living them out. And there'll come a season of growth again. But I think the call right now is to live out those things that God has done in me for God's glory and for building the kingdom.
Mhm. Um, well, thank you for coming on, Ted. If people want to buy your book or reach out to you, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
So The book is available on Amazon. It's also available on the publisher's website, which I believe is advocatesc.org. I should double check that. But Amazon, it's Kindle, it's
You can
in
get the
print. Yeah,
yeah, you can get the paperback. The title of the book is Raise Your Ebenezer. And so
that's
you can
right.
search, just Google that, and that'll probably come up with the other website too. And then tedgoshorn.com is still active. You can see some of your posts there.
Yeah.
Any
But if people want to reach out to me directly, we can use my Gmail address. I'm happy to receive folks there.
okay,
So it's tgoshorn83@gmail.com.
nice. Very cool. Any parting thoughts you have?
I don't think so. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be on the podcast, share about my journey, share about this book, and I hope that for folks who listen, if they purchase the book, that it helps them through their time of suffering.
Well, it's been helpful for me. I've enjoyed reading it, and I did a devotion this past week at our church, and I used part of it too. We looked at
Mm,
Psalm 33 about trusting in the Lord, and we read an excerpt from your book too. So I found that very helpful. So thank you,
well,
Ted.
great.
Thanks for being on the podcast.
All right. Thank you, David.